show you a building that is magic, and then I'm going to show you the magic. The building is at 40 Wall Street in New York City, in Manhattan. It's owned by the Trump Organization. About a decade ago, the Trump Organization claimed officially that this was one of the most valuable buildings in all of New York City. It's worth $527 million. It's worth more than $500 million. But then, just a few months later, the Trump Organization claimed officially that the same building, which they just said was worth $500 million, they changed their mind and declared, actually, it's worth less than $17 million. Just over the course of just a few months, the building's value had dropped to less than 1/30th of what it had been just a few months earlier. Magic. How did the Trump Organization manage to own a building that was simultaneously one of the most valuable buildings in all of New York, while also being practically worthless in New York real estate terms? How can that be? Same building. Well, when Trump's company was trying to get a loan, they wanted their assets to look as big and valuable as possible so that potential lenders would offer them as big a loan as possible. Does this make our assets look big? They listed 40 Wall Street in their financial statement as being worth $527 million to try to get loans with that as something that was a positive on their asset sheet. But then a few months later, it was property tax officials who were asking them how much that same building was worth for tax purposes. So they could figure out how much to tax that property. That's when Trump's company told the tax folks the building was actually only worth $16.7 million. Yes, please use that number when calculating our taxes. Thank you. It's less than 1/30th of the valuation we just gave this building for another purpose, but these things are complicated. That is far from the only property that Trump has pulled this kind of a stunt with. This habit of Mr. Trump and his company was first brought to public attention in congressional testimony from Trump lawyer Michael Cohen, who claimed that Trump inflated and deflated these values wildly and, importantly, purposefully to deceive banks and insurance companies and tax authorities, which, if it was done purposely, intentionally for that purpose, that would be criminal fraud. Well, now we have new reporting from David Fahrenthold and his colleagues at the Washington Post about just how serious the ongoing investigations into that potential fraud are. We'd known that a state prosecutor in Manhattan, the Manhattan District Attorney, had convened a new grand jury recently to hear evidence about the Trump Organization, to consider charges along this front. We also knew that New York's Attorney General, Tish James, has her own ongoing civil investigation into matters related to this stuff as well. But today's Post reporting adds new details about how they're going about digging into Trump's finances. For instance, AG Tish James has apparently gone after records from Trump's California Golf Club, saying that even though that's in California and she's the New York AG, her office nevertheless has jurisdiction because Trump was a New York resident at the time he was submitting wildly different valuations for that property. The AG's office has also reportedly asked for hundreds of thousands of pages of documents, including geology reports on the rock layers under Trump's golf course, because the value is affected by a history of landslides. Talking about digging deep to get to the bottom of this stuff. Joining us now is Washington Post reporter and MSNBC contributor David Fahrenthold. Mr. Fahrenthold, it's really nice to see you. Thanks very much for joining us.
Thanks for having me on.
So when a new grand jury was convened in the New York DA's investigation of these matters, I think that gave a lot of people a sort of vague sense that there might be a new line of inquiry. There might be a new potential case here. Can you give us any sense from your reporting about how far along that investigation is?
Well, as in any investigation, we're a little blind. But what we can see is that they have gone very, very deep. I mean, as you said, literally into some of these properties where they think Trump was distorting the value of the property, giving a really high valuation to somebody and a really low valuation. You know, these things are always a little bit subjective. But I think what the AG and the DA are trying to do is to figure out, okay, what facts can we establish? What's not subjective about this? And so in this case, that means learning, like, what are the rock layers under this California course? Because Trump was claiming in one venue that he could build dozens of houses on that land, and another venue is claiming he couldn't build anything. What was the truth? What was he really allowed to do? What would have been possible to do there? So they seem to have gone very, very deep on at least a few properties where, you know, because of public records or something else, I can see what they're doing. It does seem pretty far along. That said, you know, there's a lot of questions to be answered before you could file criminal charges, and I don't know how close they are to answering those, you know, questions about intent, as you said.
Ever since Mr. Cohen levied these types of allegations about the Trump Organization and about Trump in particular in that, sort of blockbuster open hearing in Congress, and other financial reporters along the way have described these similar kinds of actions by Trump over the years, I feel like those of us on the outside of it have sort of wondered, well, how much of this is just normal criminal-seeming misbehavior by people in the real estate business, but they all do this? And how much is this outside of the norms and potentially over the line in terms of criminality? I was struck by the expert who you quoted today in your piece, an expert who's appraised properties for 50 years, who looked at these different valuations and said, quote, "I've never seen anything with a gap that extreme." That was the first assessment I'd seen from somebody who really seems to know what they're talking about, to say this is not like what other people in the business do. This might be over the line.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, obviously real estate, there's a degree of puffery, there's a degree of subjectivity. But when we talked to these assessors, they said, yeah, different people might see the same property differently, but there'd be like a 10 or 15% difference. That's it. That's as far as it would normally go. In this case, as you said at the opening, the difference was, the high number was 30 times higher than the low number. Everybody we talked to who did assessments said, look, there is a gap. Gaps are expected. This is far beyond what we think is normal.